sleeper must awake.
I think I'd be lying if I said that I had podcasting dreams. But what I can say is, for sure, I had dreams, or at least very strong hopes, that one day I'd find a way to connect with people who I consider great minds and, enlightening and inspiring people, and that I'd be able to connect with them and exchange ideas. And I didn't really think it would come from podcasting. But I mean, apparently that's the way it goes. And today's episode with James Tunney is, if I had to imagine a perfect situation where I had this kind of connection with someone, it would be pretty close to that episode. There's something strange about, something abnormal but beautiful at the same time, about the connection between a host and a guest on this kind of show. Because it's not that the conversation is artificial in any way, but it's not, we can't say that it's normal. I mean, we're basically not dealing with trivialities, and we go straight to the point, straight to the deep stuff. That's what we're both here for. And this mindset that we have to put ourselves into talking of like very complex and personal, sometimes personal stuff, with a stranger, that's special. And yeah, I think it's beautiful. I love it. But do I deserve the title of a podcaster yet? Well, I'm not so sure, because I finally forgot the basic, which was to ask James the ending question: where can people find you and your work? Oh man, I hope James can pardon me that that bubble to the brain that I had at the end that made me forget that it's a podcast, it's a show. Fortunately, with James, it's pretty straightforward, so I can say it right now. And it's going to be in the show notes anyways, but James is not on social media, so to find anything on James and his work, you simply have to go to jamestunney.com. Pretty simple. So yeah, am I a podcaster? Well, maybe I'm slowly getting there. I do feel more and more comfortable with the camera and the mic, and still having trouble being straightforward with my questions. But there's deeper reasons for that than just being nervous, or maybe I'll talk about that one day. Hey, I should probably present myself, actually. There's another thing that I always forget to do. So you're listening to Hopscotch Chronicles podcast. My name is Dominic DEE. Today's episode is with James Tunney. This is our 7th episode. Yeah, as I said, a very great talk. James, to me, is very impressive. It's hard for me to understand how someone can hold so much data in his brain and connect it also to a deeper reality. That's the other part that's special about James. I very much agree with his description of mysticism as a kind of a more of a general attitude of openness. So maybe that's why I felt that we connected very well, actually. I think also I should explain a bit about, I was mentioning that the fact that I kind of have a non-dual view of the world in many ways kind of isolates me from the rest of the world. What I meant by that is that it's often complex for me to truly make decisions that I feel are ethical and based on a natural moral ground, natural with a big N, if you want to call it that. And this is something that James is able to do. I mean, having opinions about what's good for the world is something that I sometimes disagree with. Not in the case of James, because in the case of James, it's a very enlightened position, and although I have trouble understanding how he can think this way, I still have I'm still very impressed by this capacity. And also, like, because James has had a career in law. He was a barrister, and so his understanding of legislation and rules and being able to connect all of that in a mystical way, that's very impressive for me. So that's why I love listening to him talk. So there you go. Let's move right ahead with the bio. James sent me one saying that he was real happy to keep it short. So here it goes. James Tunney left a career in law to explore art and spirituality. He now concentrates on explaining or advocating for spiritual evolution in the face of an attack on humanity itself, not least by technology. That's a great cause, I think. So I'll just add, very prolific artist, writer, thinker, mystic. Also in the show notes, and we talk about this at close to the beginning of the interview, there's a link that you'll find that's actually on James's website, where there's a ton of interviews that he's done over the years. Most of them on the New Thinking Aloud channel with Jeffrey Mishlove. I mean, just go look at that and look at the topics. It's just mind blowing. The variety of things that James is able to talk about and a lot of depth, that's, yeah, mind blowing. All right. So without further ado, see, I was able to say it right now. Without further ado, let's move on with the interview. James Tunney. It's a great honor for me to have you on my show today. Like as maybe people know by now, I've worked many years in a warehouse just packing orders, web orders of tea and teaware, and people like you have kept me from going completely insane for so many years, and I've listened to literally dozens of hours of you speaking, especially on Jeffrey Mishlov's show. So yeah, it's truly an honor.
Dominic, that's very nice. I mean, when you're doing these interviews, sometimes you don't know what happens. You have a relationship with the interviewer, so it's very nice to hear that, and I'm very appreciative of the people that do take the time, and especially if they get something out of it, it sustains me. So I appreciate that, and so thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity and the discussion we're going to have.
Great. So I thought, it's just for so people know, I thought there would be like a playlist of all your interviews with Jeffrey Mishlove on Dr. Mishlov's channel, but there is.
They can see it on my website, and I'll put this link to this one as well. So on the website.
Oh, great. Okay, that's good then. Yeah. Okay, but I think I'll create that playlist, and so it'll be in the show note for people who want to really get into the mind of James Tunney.
It's all on there. So just form a link to that, and I'll save you any work. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Cool. So, as I was saying before we started recording, to me, because when people see how many interviews you've done on very, very specific subject, and you're one of the most knowledgeable people about, to me at least, I haven't encountered many people as knowledgeable as you as when it comes to mysticism, and even where finding mysticism when we don't necessarily expect it, and people in authors or like historical figures that we don't know they have like a mystical aspect to them, but you even go there. So figuring out what I was going to ask you today was at first kind of a challenge. But then I remembered a bit over 3 years ago now, as I was working at the said warehouse, there's something that you said that stuck with me, and I even posted it back then. I'm not really active on Instagram on my personal account anymore, but I'm going to show the proof. I'm going to read it, so you don't have to read it. Just show the little post-it note that I made for myself on November 14th, 2020. And I'm going to read the quote. And because for me, it's kind of the basis of what I wanted to address with you today. So the quote is, "Technology won't be the end of us. Our failure to see ourselves as spiritual beings will." And so I thought that could be, well, first of all, because technology is so, I should say, overwhelming these days that, it's definitely an important subject to address. And so I guess transhumanism, technology. We talked a tiny bit about posthumanism in emails also, so I want to address that in this talk. I thought just really quickly though, and I'm experimenting with a traditional first question. So just to start, for people who don't know you, what does a typical day in the mind of James Tunney look like?
Well, coming from an Irish background, a republicanism, where the motto was whatever you say nothing. Don't tell them anything. I tend to get on with my stuff, but I have a family, and so when they were small, I looked after them. Today, for example, as I usually do, I was up in a little hole in the lake. It was about -4, which is warmer than the last. It'd be -10. So swimming in the lake, it's important for me. So I like the cold, and that's an old tradition. Long before Wim Hof and that did it, we can find the Irish monks doing similar things. So I like to get up the wood. I get up early and write every day, and that has been consistent now for the last few years. I did up to very recently do a fair bit of training in martial arts, just in for the enjoyment of it, and especially I've been dragged into things with the kids over the years. So I started judo late, and capoeira, and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and a whole lot. But in the last few years, and particularly after the COVID thing, unfortunately, I realized that I have to spend more time writing, because really, as I see it, there's an obligation to the next generation to deal with these issues and to address them. And some of the issues I realized I understand better than anyone else. So I tend to, another strange thing about going in the lake is that the lake speaks to you, and there's an old expression in the Irish about the tongue of the lake, or the language of the lake. And in many ways, I become very conscious that you're the sounding board of nature when you begin to involve yourself in it. So I always come home with a poem from a walk in the woods. So writing is critical. I've been painting the last couple of weeks. It's difficult sometimes to do them both, because they demand energy, but in a different way. So doing them in parallel has not, it varies, it kind of oscillates, but I have been doing that recently. So painting and writing is an essential part for me, and I like a bit of mental space. Mental space is important for me. I did work for years in the university, so I had all that kind of going in before crowds every day. So it's not something that I missed. I've had plenty of experience. I enjoyed that at the time, but I'm very content to do my own thing. So that type of thing. And in particular, you mentioned it in your question, and in my commitment to mysticism in particular, it was driven by a primary statement, which is at the start of the mystical accord, which is the fact that there's been a certain failure of spiritual evolution. And this, for me, came from the ether one day, and it was also a demonstration of the way mystical things happen. It wasn't constructed, and it just appears as certain things do. And I began to think about that, and that set me off on it wasn't that I was new to spirituality or whatever, but I hadn't been concentrating, and I'd been doing other things and concentrating on a lot of other things. But I began to pull at that thread and really begin to open myself up to that and reflect on whether, or to what extent, there has been a failure of spiritual evolution and what that means. And I came to the conclusion, or it emerged, that there's a circular kind of loop, that the failure to evolve spiritually is the cause of the problems that we're facing and the solution. So if we continue with the failure to evolve spiritually, well, then the technology will take over us. Now, on the technological side, the dark side is this left brain fascination with technology. And people say, "Oh, you're talking on Zoom, and you're using technology," and it's a daft argument. I've always been interested in technology, not in a kind of geeky way, but in a macro way. From the '60s, I was interested in what the impact it has. So I accepted what Arthur C. Clarke said in the '60s about the impact on technology. What I couldn't understand then even was that the future evolution of humanity would be the merger of humans and machines. That was just, I just assumed that was an aberration, that it wasn't serious. So when I came back to the mysticism and began to take it really seriously as a function of your daily life, so to corroborate the question that you asked about daily life, I believe that mysticism is a general attitude. It's a general attitude of openness to inspiration, and that in many ways the nature of our spiritual consciousness is above words. That's why I describe it in terms of light. So it's incapable of being necessarily contained and constrained and concentrated in words or music. That's a reflection of the higher thing. It's an indication. It's not the end of it. It's not it itself, in fact. It's not the Tao, if you like. So the attitude is important. Now, and in that attitude, where one finds one's spiritual consciousness, one realizes that all the promises of technology, of artificial intelligence, cannot replicate or give back that which we have in ourselves. And we're in danger of losing this. We're in danger of losing because we don't understand we have it. And we've been convinced that there's nothing there in some sense. And I was thinking of today from the kids. It came into my head today from the kids and the Smurfs. I forget what they call them, and the Smurf, and Gargamel chasing the Smurfs to get their essence, that he can use in a potion. So it's worse than that for us, because they're chasing us to get our essence, but they've convinced us that we don't have any essence. And this is philosophically, I've talked about transhumanism, but I'm concentrating recently on posthumanism. And it's a devastating assault intellectually on the human being, on the human species, and it's a really dangerous one. So what's implicit in this is you say, well, people say, well, what do mystics do? Or what I believe that the individual mystic has to do now is to vindicate the significance of spiritual consciousness and the significance of the human, because from 1864 in particular, they began to attack the spirit as a mode and began to dispirit us in scientific discourse. It was a deliberate policy. That's where psychology came as a substitute, psychic forces as a substitute. And that has worked on people. So some of my friends I talk to, and when I talk about spirit, they kind of look at me as if I'm trying to sell them something, or I'm telling them a lie, or I'm pulling their leg, or they just don't get it at all. And this attitude is going to grow as well, whereas other people are becoming a bit more disposed to it. So the posthumanism represents an attack on the very foundation of human existence. Now, and I believe the more I look at the literature, as I have studied genocide in a legal context and other things, when you begin to talk in a certain way, you get particular results. It's very dangerous to talk about humans as animals. It's very, very, it's part of a step towards genocide. I believe now we're talking about anthropocide, about the destruction of the species itself. It's quite incredible. Churchill talked about this in 1924, about do we want to commit suicide? He's talking about the species, because he saw it 100 years ago and kind of contributed a bit towards it. But this is the kind of thing we're in. There's a deep, deep misanthropy, a deep, deep hatred of the human, a deep, deep self-loathing, a deep hatred of the body, a deep hatred of incarnation. And That's hence the escape, hence what's called the Promethean shame by Gunther Anders, this idea, oh, look at them lovely machines, everything's okay with them. And so therefore, the mystic, as far as I can see it, is not, from my perspective, is not called to escape from the world. They're called to be embodied in the world and to demonstrate spiritual consciousness, and also to begin to make it work to solve the problem, to advocate for spirituality and to address the issues. And if there is power in spiritual consciousness, to manifest it. So in summary, to put them together, spiritual evolution is the critical point. There's many paths to that, but we have to. It depends on us taking our spiritual consciousness seriously. Even if we're involved in a religion, you still have to individually commit yourself to your spiritual development, irrespective of whatever system you adopt. And the threat to all religions is this attack: artificial intelligence, technology, philosophy, which threatens to undermine all the religions. So if we imagine that all religions are founded on mysticism, and then they become crystallized, and mystical streams can come through them, the technology is threatening the very foundation of everything, of all of that. Will cut through that, will destroy all religion, and will destroy all mystical potential, especially if they mess with the human brain. So therefore, the corrective and the necessity for the mystic is to address this, is to value, to explain, to explore, to contribute, to have dialogue about the nature of our spiritual consciousness.
That's perfect, and that's why we're talking today, because I also find all of this very, very important. And it's really strange, almost mind-boggling for me how you as I was saying, I contrary to the other interviews that I've done, I've tried to build a kind of a thread for us to follow, but you've already begun to grow the branches on the tree of our conversation, because you've addressed evolution, Promethean fire, technology. It's all in there, so it's cool. I mean,
okay, see you next week.
Yeah, the seed is planted and it's growing well, so I'm happy about that. So we're talking about technology, and just to start with that term, okay, I'm gonna define. I'm gonna give you an example. I'm gonna define it well for the listeners, because I think understanding what is and what isn't technology, and where we draw the line in our own use of it, is pretty important. And it's not that clear, because technology, it seems to me, is on some sort of a spectrum in a way. And the example I'm going to give you and the listeners is, and it's funny because it's not something I've used personally before, but the example I use is nutritional supplements. You know, so if we start with a very technological example of that, would be the machine-made pills that are their content has been very, very strongly chemically managed, basically, you know. But then if we move down, we have them still machine made, but it's all, they call it natural ingredients, you know, so they're maybe not transformed or processed as much. But then you could also have just basically dried plants packed in little pills, you know. And then if we move down, we have, you know, we could just take the plants and brew them in hot water for tea, herbal tea. We could also consume them raw, just take the leaves right off the plant, and that would be the least of technological intervention, if you will. But if we could go even further, and we could pray to the to the spirit of the plant, or to and some sort of external god or entity. Or we could even decide to just use our minds to do what the supplements would do, So I've I've spanned the whole spectrum, and for me, it's not that clear where we should. Well, for me, it is. I personally have my own opinion on that, but I'm curious to know how you would see it. Like, how do we decide where we draw the line when it comes to the use of technology? Yeah.
There's two thinkers that come to mind immediately when you say that. One is Lewis Mumford, talking about the mega machine, looking at the entire process on a macro level about how things work. That's important. And the other one is Ivan Illich and his idea of conviviality, and what technology promotes conviviality and what doesn't. And then we could also add in the French, Jacques Ellul and Bernard Charbonneau, and of course, Jacques Ellul was the big critic of the technological society, and he emphasizes technique as opposed to the machine element, just the way things are done. And both of them, although one of them was a Marxist and the other one was quite on the left wing as well, and he wasn't religious. Ellul was, Charbonneau wasn't, but he came from a kind of Protestant background. But they both believed that in the Christian story, the incarnation was the critical story, about the idea of being incarnated, about in flesh. And associate with that, they prized the French kind of peasant kind of lifestyle, being close to the earth and that context. Now, people might think that's romantic ecology, whatever. These were ahead of the game in relation to the ecological movement as well. So from that critique, they kind of came to a result. The problem is that if you come from an Irish perspective, so when I talk to old guys in Ireland, I know that they would, when they were small, have met people that survived the famine in Ireland. And the famine, of course, when a million people die, a million people emigrate, it's not that long time ago in historical terms. Why did they die? Because they were dependent on potatoes. Potatoes is not indigenous to Ireland, but they were forced to grow potatoes because it was the only marginal land left to them when the colonial force took the land. And we could also, I'm not going to speculate about the cause of the famine, but there are interesting contexts about that. And there are interesting contexts about the attitude towards human life. So a number of the British administrators said that in the future it will be easier to see a red Indian, as they called it, on the banks of the Liffey than an Irishman. Now, this attitude has not gone away. This attitude of utter disrespect for human life is there. Now, we believe that it has gone away. Now, my political argument, this is the context of politics, my argument that I make, and I'll make it clearer and clearer over time, is that the European empires never went away. And in particular, the greatest empire of them all, the British Empire, changed, it transmuted, it didn't disappear. It transmuted into a different form, in particular in the 1920s. They realized that they wouldn't be able to run the colonies. So they shifted into commerce, finance, regulation, international trade, and to establish the global systems. That's laid out by H.G. Wells. It was intuited by Churchill and that. And so you had all the thinkers in the 1920s telling about what the future would be like. And they realized that they were in a good position to control the communications technology. They had the communications network. They had the undersea cables, the telegraph system very much involved, etc. So they're in a good position to control this apparatus that would be the future, which is why people like Arthur C. Clarke is so interested in communication technology, fits into that. In 1947, he said he was convinced by a speech by Arthur Toynbee in Senate House in London about, you know, the British Empire creating the scaffolding, or the Anglosphere creating the scaffolding for this new world order. So you have to look at what their policies are in these things. So whatever you and me decide to do is dependent as well on these macro forces. So what are they trying to do? What are the things that they've said? They've made it very, very clear. The world, the flesh, and the devil is an example, and the 28, 29. J.D. Bernal, and they identified the key elements of this movement, that there's space travel. Why space travel? Well, because they want to get off the planet, because they know what's going to happen when they've done what they're going to do to it. Basically, that seems to be an escape route. So space travel, and of course, they're going to become interplanetary. But there's first, the A reason is to have an escape route. The B reason is to travel for resource. That comes kind of afterwards. Life extension is another key factor, to extend life. They want to extend life, and they want to increase intelligence. And this is done, according to Bernal, and this was supported, I think, by Birkenhead and Lord Birkenhead and other people that were in government. Now, Earl Birkenhead and Churchill had negotiated with the Irish Republicans in 1921. So this is the context. They're realizing they can't do this all the time, that the people that are fighting against the empire will keep coming, will keep engaging. So they're saying, okay, we'll go the Wells way, basically, as Wells and Churchill were close together. So space travel, life extension, intelligence increase are three elements, and that involves a total transformation of the human into a mechanical being, that the human becomes a machine. And this is where all the matrix ideas go back to. So this is where Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is informed by. The babies are born, you know, in ectogenesis, and like in the Matrix. It goes back to this plan that they have to make humans machines, basically. And that would solve the biological problem, because all of these guys that drive this agenda, like J.D. Bernal, who was a Stalinist as well. A lot of them were quite extreme left. H.G. Wells thought that Stalin was a great man. You know, maybe he didn't plan enough, but they had great admiration for Bolshevik Russia. J.D. Bernal, the great crystallographer, wrote a beautiful obituary for Stalin, praising him as a great scientist, because of course that's what Stalin described as scientific socialism. So they're all involved in a very strong idea about creating this material future, informed obviously by Nietzsche and the Superman, the superhuman, the Übermensch, all that kind of stuff. But this transfer to material is important because they don't like the vulnerability of the human body. They don't like this fleshiness. They don't like this incarnation. They want to be as gods, and they want to make people machine-like and tied up to the system. And of course, coming from an imperial system, which is designed to control people, this is an ideal way to control people if you force them into a system. And of course, it's predicated on the idea as well of Darwinian evolution. And Darwinian evolution was promoted by Thomas Henry Huxley, who promoted this anti-spirit idea, agnosticism, which means you have to prove things scientifically in order for them to exist. So if you say you have a mystical experience, you'd have to prove it in some way scientifically, which is impossible to do. They take the seer out of, almost, but they take the seer out of the thing. They ignore the very thing that they claim doesn't exist for the benefit of their equation. And Huxley was H.G. Wells' teacher, and Wells brought on the thing, and following on from Wells, you had Arthur C. Clarke, and so you have this thing. So then when we come to modern people, people get annoyed when I say, look, you have to look at some of your heroes again. They really get annoyed. They say, oh yeah, I agree with you, but you can't say anything about Terence McKenna. I get this all the time. You're wrong about him. Yeah, and they get really kind of protective about Terence McKenna or Robert Anton Wilson. Now, I like these guys, but I ask people to listen to what they go. I have more respect for them because I listen to what they actually said. Robert Anton Wilson and Timothy Leary. If you look at what they say, all their agenda is consistent with what the guys said in the 1920s. So what I ask myself is, where does this fit into the overall picture? We have to go back to what they said they were going to do. And if it's furthering that aim, then, so if we to judge Elon Musk, space travel, he's not so big in the life extension, but he is on the intelligence increase and the brain-computer interface. It's all written now. So it's all in the plan. And even Thomas Henry Huxley, the name of the club he set up of scientists to enter into other institutions was called the X Club. So I, of course, when I see SpaceX, I say, well, this is where it comes from. I mean, this is the pattern. You can't ignore the historical context. They're telling you straight up, as far as I can see. It's utterly consistent. So when it comes to the issue of food, there's a few principles in relation to distinguishing transhumanism from humanism. That the restoration, first principle is the restoration of normal human expectations is not transhumanism, because you're only restoring a humanism. It's restorative. It's not an enhancement. It's not an addition, an augmentation. So so for example, Harrington would see the contraceptive pill as a classic example of a transhumanist move to suppress something in the human body, a direct influence, different from taking a vitamin C or something. So that's one principle. The second one is that obviously the closer you get to its source in some original context, the better in general, the closer it is to the environment we're adapted to. And here is the thing that doesn't make sense. For 160 years, whatever, the scientists have been drilling us with the significance of natural selection. So when we come to the point where the principle is accepted, they immediately shift to artificial selection. Well, because it's natural selection, we're not doing that anymore. It's artificial selection. So it doesn't make sense. If you understood natural selection, you'd say, okay, well then what we're going to do is live more consistent with our abilities that we're adapted to. But the policy is to adapt the environment. Now, this goes back longer. This goes back to Francis Bacon. And Francis Bacon and the idea of plantation, the idea of colonization, was about changing the environment to suit power, not all mankind, to suit power structures. So you change the environment. You create a technosphere. This is where all the Crystal Palace, all these ideas came from. We're going to create in what Dawkins called the extended phenotype. We're going to create the world, and we're going to adapt the world to our needs. Now, here is the problem. Last point. Post-humanism critiques all humans. So you're responsible for this. You and people like you, and especially, and even on the basis of the color of your skin, you're more responsible for this. Unbelievable. This is the way to do it. They haven't read Irish history, but it's unbelievable. So what that is, what I believe is that this is part of the continuation of that, if you like, capitalist, whatever you want, technological. I see the capitalist and communist as the same materialist system. They're trying to blame everyone, so we won't blame the people who are responsible, the people with the resources. That's what the objective. It's the whole lot of humankind, and this gives them the legitimacy to interfere directly in the human and also to eradicate them. That's what the consequence of it is. So, sorry, I went on too long there a bit, Dominic. Apologize.
No. I've listened to you before. I know how it works. I love it. But I mean, you've touched on many points that I wanted to address anyway. So, but I'm curious if we want to go a bit more into posthumanism, even if we kind of went over that. Okay, well, I should start with saying that I haven't dug that much into the concept, so just to kind of recount what we've been saying in our emails, I've heard. I wonder if I should name names here, but I guess I should. I could. So my understanding of post-humanism has come mostly from Debashish Banerjee, who was interviewed on New Thinking Aloud with Jeffrey Mishlove.
Yeah, I heard it, yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised if you watched that interview. So my understanding was that what he was proposing was something that a view of post-humanism that was more related to the innate abilities of the human. So based on on practicing the siddhis and that we find in the Vedas, that basically the human over time, and maybe there's something just normal or evolutionary in that view of the term. So basically, the humans would become kind of godly in a way, but it would be through, in a way, natural means, as the other use of the term that I've seen out there. And I'm wondering how much it's intentional, actually, to kind of make us forget about that, if such a version of post-humanism exists, just to make sure we don't go that way, and just presenting post-humanism as an offshoot of transhumanism, and so that eventually we would have merged so much with the machine that our psyches would be kind of a mishmash of AI and, you know, like brain manifestations or something. And same with our bodies, so we can't call us human anymore, you know. So in other terms, and this is where the image of the Promethean fire comes in, and for me it's been a question, like, what does it mean exactly? And I'm sure you know a lot more about that than me. So what does it represent exactly? The Promethean fire, is it a metaphor for faking through electronic means, basically computational and robotic means, the superpower, quote unquote, superpowers of the gods? Or does that fire, in fact, in truth, represent the ability of humans to develop something akin to, like eternal life or omnipresence or something akin to that? So I don't know if I'm being very clear here, but what do you have to say about this?
I'll try and link them together just to explain to people where we're talking about. Now, humanism is immediately they set up a straw man and they say this is what humanism is, and then they go on to say, oh well, we don't want that, we want this, post-humanism. So just to explain to people, perhaps starting with transhumanism. So transhumanism is a term that's really got popular in the last 20 years and refers to context of artificial enhancement or augmentation of human functions with technology. So it's a human plus, it's adding to. So the post-humanists criticize them and say, oh, well, you're not changing humanism too much, you're just adding to it, you're being more humanist. And sometimes I feel more sympathetic to the transhumanists when I hear that argument. The post-humanists, and again, there's a whole different, I'm not going to bore you going through all the literature on it, but there's a whole range of what it is. So, I mean, if you follow the transhumanist path, you're going to come to a post-human situation anyway. At a certain point with the merger with machine, you'll become something else, and you will therefore be post-human in the same as the way that Max Tegmark talked about human 3.0. They won't be the old humans, and Philip K. Dick even talked about this. But post-humanism claims to be, in many senses, a mixture of things which critiques humanism. Now, what they say about humanism, they say humanism, they said there was never an agreement on the definition of what humanism is or what humans are. This is a key proposition. They say there was never an agreement on what a human is. Now, this is quite remarkable, but this is what they say. And they say because women were excluded, children were excluded, it was only, white, this is the typical argument, standard argument, white, Western, independent men. That was, so they present that like a cowboy film or something out of the 1920s, the horse operas as they were called. And then they say, we don't want that. We have to move on. We have to move on to post-humanism. And the technology is coming, so it changes everyone. So the boundaries break down. There's no such thing as a human species. If you focus on the human species as superior, you're a speciesist. And that's wrong. And we can't have this hierarchy. Humans are not special. And it goes on like that. So that's the context in which I read Debashish when I look at the literature. Now, he is one of the better ones. So when I hear that interview, I've nothing really to not too much to criticize about it. So I don't want to certainly attack him. He is one of the better ones, and if you read these edited volumes, and they're very articulate, very nuanced, very complex arguments. I don't want to oversimplify them, but the implication of post-humanism, you can't get away, is to break down the idea of humanness and the human, whatever way they say it, by breaking in the boundaries. And they kind of vindicate the inevitability of this technical penetration of the human body for me, and the connection, the necessary connection. They take it as a fait accompli, and therefore it's done. We accept this. And people like Donna Haraway, although she doesn't describe herself as post-humanist anymore, talk about, I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess. And there's these motifs, the cyborg, the zombie, all these kind of things with the post-human stuff. And this is supposedly based on a love of animals, or more respect for ecology, more respect for insects. Why we look down on insects, looking at the arguments whether we should eat insects or not. Some of them are really maybe a great surprise to people if they begin to look at some of the arguments. My argument is that post-humanism is a product of this attitude that I talked about in the 1920s. It's merely a manifestation of this that came out of the military-industrial complex. It is a preparation for the next stage that the military-industrial complex, the deep state, transnational corporations have planned for us. So you have no human rights. And when they say that they weren't regarded as humans, they usually say, well, it's really in law, it's certain that there was exclusions. That's not true. And I know from legal history, this is an inaccurate description of the identification. They confuse things like legal standing, locus standi, legal capacity, and things like that that are not about the definition of a human. It's on a weak foundation. And then they locate humanism in the Renaissance, and that's only one. They either say it was started in the Renaissance or it was started in the Enlightenment. Now they're hugely different things. It depends who you pick. If you pick the Enlightenment, you're in a narrower zone. If you pick the humanism of the Renaissance, and you talk about Pico de Mirandola, he saw everything as interconnected. He never put the human, especially, he focused on human dignity, but the human was in a vast chain of being, everything. It's absurd to extract a humanism. The humanism that they're talking about comes out of the scientific tradition which is promoting post-humanism. So I believe that this post-humanism, in its origin, really is embedded. Now, I'm not saying about Debashish or any of those individuals are doing that, but this is the origin in my view. And this is where transhumanism comes from. Where did the term come from? It comes from Julian Huxley. I mean, it's Julian Huxley, grandson of Huxley, British Empire, head of UNESCO, expanding New World Order, all that kind of stuff. It's all there. So this is the tradition that they come in. And I after looking at the literature, I'll not be convinced otherwise. The implications are profoundly disturbing. Profoundly disturbing. I believe they will be used. Here's Mao Zedong said that revolution is, the famous quote, it's not a garden party. And some of the humanists don't seem to understand the implications of what they're saying and the license they're giving to emerging governance to act in particular ways on the subject. And in particular, once you abolish this concept of human dignity, well, then you've no obligation to accord human rights. Now, we've seen human rights being picked apart in the last few years. You've seen it in Canada in the last few years, they're taken apart. Well, in this idea, if we abolish the notion of human, there's no even pretense. We've gone past the emergency legislation when they just wiped the slate clean. There'll be no commitments to anything like that. So I see it as very dangerous. I see it as very ill-informed. Again, I'm not Debashish, and I'm not saying about that. I'm talking about the whole thing, the whole movement. Ill-informed on a legal perspective, wrong, misconstrued, and dangerous. And I see it as a reflection of this tradition. And the claims, they embrace, it sounds good if you get, we're in favor of animals, we're in favor of these ancient things, we're in favor of this, we're in favor of that, and you say, well, actually, when you look, it's an unsustainable alliance that they claim. They stand in front of these movements with little causal relationship between them, and they threaten to undermine all the achievements of those movements that have, over periods of time, gained women's rights, gained right to anti-discrimination, etc. And it fails to understand basic principles like equality, what equality before the law was, and how long it existed. They fail to understand equity was a particular legal jurisdiction associated which modified the common law courts. They failed to understand them. They failed to understand what was happening in Europe for the 1500 years before the Renaissance. What was happening with the idea of the human, the dignity of the human. They just ignore all that kind of stuff. They failed to understand. I'll give you an example. In Ireland, in the early monks, in 697, they promulgated a code on the protection of women and children, group, in combat. And they brought together people from Ireland, Scotland, England. It was an international convention, an agreement that the monks brokered to protect women and children and non-combatants long before the Geneva Convention. So I'm hearing all kinds of daft stuff. I was listening to a man that I was otherwise enjoying, an Islamic scholar who said that human rights began in the 1960s. It's kind of shocking. And the post-humanists are saying there was nothing there before. They're ignoring all that because they don't know about it. And even on the things like, intersection of rights. In French legal cases, for example, there's plenty of evidence where the ecclesiastical courts in particular, made orders which were directed to swarms of insects. It's incredible, but it's there in the record. Pigs and that were prosecuted. So the idea that they weren't regarded as legal persons even is wrong. In the 1920s, the Privy Council in London, hearing an appeal from the Indian courts, held that an idol could hold legal rights and have legal standing. Their analysis of history is wrong because really this is a continuation of postmodernism. It's an ideological agenda underneath it, whether people realize it or not. It's a deconstructive thing. And what's been deconstructed is the humans and the idea of spirituality. So we're forced to, once you go on that path, it's difficult to come back, in my view. I don't care about the possibilities, the intellectual possibilities. These are not intellectual things. When we're talking about spiritual consciousness, we're not talking about constructs. We're talking about real forces. The mystical things that we're talking about are actual forces. They're not constructs. This is what a lot of people don't understand. The Promethean bit informs both post-humanism and transhumanism. And in fact, Prometheus was mentioned in the title of the article where post-human was first used. So Prometheanism represents the aspect of the human mind which privileges the human will, the magical aspect, and the ruthless aspect. So Prometheans want to be gods in many senses. They feel resentment that there are gods or higher forces. That's why they want to, steal the fire for the humans. I don't think so. Not, that's not what the objective is. The power is the most important thing. So it fits into the kind of Aleister Crowley will of the magician idea. And we can see in the 1960s what it specifically meant by Feinberg and people in America who influenced the present generation of AI and advocates who claim now that they are making God. This is what they're claiming. They are making God. Now, that's not good for you, I can guarantee. But Feinberg and that identified the elements of Prometheanism as he saw it. Space exploration, life extension, the same old stuff. It's the same old stuff. Yep. It's an imperial agenda. So when you come to judge things, if you judge things and what they said they were doing 100 years ago, the empires, as they're transitioning to their new empires, the empire of scientism, as I call them, well, then you can follow the path through. And then Prometheanism is a vague notion. The last point on this, there's a lot of undermining of traditional religion. So, for example, they say, oh, well, Jesus was a myth, so we can disregard it. But Prometheus is a myth with much less in it, and it's a central philosophy. It's absurd. So I'm sticking with the validity of especially long spiritual traditions. I respect them all and try and learn off them, and we can't cast them aside. We can't be misled. We have to see what's there and extend them ourselves. But I've become very critical, and I will be very critical of post-humanism, notwithstanding Debashish is a very good speaker and very engaging and very nice. Seems very nice man, and I'm not attributing those motivations to him. You look a bit like my John Dee here behind me now. Looking at you on the thing, which are hats and your beards.
And there's another thing that's really interesting about that also, and well, we're going to come back to what we were saying, but just as an aside, there's been in the few last shows, there's been kind of a wire that connects everything, even though like I didn't choose it, and because you mentioned Crowley, you mentioned and then we have John Dee and the mention of I haven't had time to read actually. But the two last people that I've interviewed are both magicians. So the first one was Douglas Batchelor, host of the What Magic Is This podcast, pretty big podcast about magic. And my last interview was with Denis Poisson, also known as Foolish Fish, who's doing a lot of magic and occult and esoteric book reviews, but also has a lot of videos about his philosophies and his practice also. And what's interesting is even though I didn't ask Douglas about Crowley, we ended up talking about Crowley's view of the holy guardian angel. And then Denis Poisson posted a video about the great work of the magician and mentioning the holy guardian angel in a very different way. So I thought, I'm going to reach out to him, And in my research, I saw a video of Denis Poisson in which he called, I think the video was called "The Problem with My Religion," and in which he describes himself as a perennialist, basically. So that's kind of interesting that, because I correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's how you would also describe yourself. That's the word you would use to describe
certainly
yourself.
Certainly is one of them. Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Right. So that's interesting for me to.
Subjects to yeah.
Yeah, well,
Go on.
that's something that it's also something that I don't know that much about. So I asked Denis' opinion about this, and it seemed pretty clear from what he was saying that it's again kind of a touchy subject. Like what exactly is that? And that was going to be my first question to you to kind of continue that link. What does it mean exactly?
Yeah.
For you to be a perennialist, and how does that manifest in your daily life?
Yeah.
We can go there if you want, or
certainly, yeah, it's an important question. I was asked about that yesterday by someone, and it's an important question. And immediately, we'd have to say that there are different streams of perennialism. So you have two ideas, I think, two broad ideas. They all say a similar thing. They all say that the great traditions have a core base, or a common core, or a similar base, or similar principles, or are tending in the same direction. And from that, some people say, well, therefore you can pick and choose and extract yourself in a Gnostic way, if you like, where to go. Other more, if you like, traditional perennialists say, well, actually the best way to do it is to work in one tradition and deepen yourself in that. So you might, whatever way you choose, you're still going the right direction, whether you're Sufi or Catholic or whatever, if you're being mystical, but you're deepening your knowledge of one thing. So this is a difference. Some perennialists would reject, the religious structure of, that tradition, even though, like Charles Upton, for example, who follows that Sufi tradition. Obviously, he has to embed himself, or there's debates about it, but he is embedded in Islamic scholarship as well. So that's not inconsistent. And when you get to a point, a depth that he is, he would have as much respect for the path in the Christian tradition, or whatever. So they don't see them as mutually exclusive, which is important, where some traditionalists would say, no, this is my exclusive path. So there's different emphasis in that, and it creates a challenge. And these are where some of the most difficult issues come in relation to the mystical path, between the esoteric and the exoteric. So you might be able to engage in all kinds of wonderful things about, whatever. You might have all the cities and all that, but they may amount to nothing if it's not related to, in some views, if it's not anchored in a context. And this is a great difficulty, because a lot of Gnostics with a small g will reject the idea that they're bound by any rules, that they should follow. Why should they follow commandments, or why should they follow? And this is the great difficulty. And this is part of a Western decadence, if you like, probably because Western society is collapsing, that they have assumed that the inculcated Judeo-Christian principles in society are going to continue. But they're not going to continue. They're dependent on some conditions that when you take away all the theological input, there won't be that principle. So what do you say to a person that doesn't believe, that they can't take your life, that doesn't? What do you say to a person that has no conception of any restrictions? It's not that they have a problem in doing it. It's that they have no conception that there's anything wrong with it. And especially when you've undermined the legal protection. So there is a tension there that in the West, and in particular, if we look at the spiritual movement in California, the spiritual movement in California, it's been a base for the spiritual movement. But they choose a particular type. They choose, they're disposed towards Orientalism. They're disposed towards India, Buddhism, and in some ways, of course, what else is California famous for, apart from being, where the empire went to establish its base, the British Empire, for communications and computer. It's famous for the military-industrial complex. That's where its heart, its beating heart is. Okay, so you have this strange. You say, well, okay, that could be a reaction against the military-industrial complex. Some of it is. Could also be a continuation of the military-industrial complex, because you can extract. You can say, well, the Bhagavad Gita shows, that war is okay and just do your best. There is these arguments, and there are difficulties there when you say, well, so there's a very strong idea in people that are interested in post-humanism, transhumanism, that we'll have spirituality, but there's no dogma. We can't have any dogma. And you say, well, okay, well, is it okay to steal? Where do we start? You know what I mean? These are serious questions, because these are being undermined now, because there's plenty of people now. It's a thing that I wouldn't have thought that I would have seen in my life, that believe morally that it's okay to steal. That's because of political changes. This is quite incredible. And soon they will believe that it's okay morally to kill. So the question is the link as well between so it's not actually, a lot of the questions are not about the esoteric dimensions. There's loads of traditions to draw on. It's about what rules do you stand for in relation to how we run society? Simple things like that. And that's a kind of becoming more and more difficult, especially when you abolish, right? So I did ask someone last week, I was saying, I don't really understand what you're saying. Just give us a simple question. Do you believe it's wrong to steal? And I didn't get an answer back. Now maybe they overlooked the question, but I mean, I just want to find out what it is. So the perennialist, in many senses, is referring as well to an exoteric tradition, some rules. And when you look at them, a lot of them are not really, and its core is not, you're not meant to be killing, you're not meant to be stealing. I mean, we can argue about the exceptions in the penumbra, but I mean, there's some principles that are pretty consistent in all cultures. Now, when you say, well, we don't want any of that, well, I'm concerned. I'm concerned about what that means. And then you say, well, why do we have these rules? Now, if we take an idea that, well, say in a Christian context, you're a divine reflection, you're created in the image of God, I must recognize you because of that, and therefore I mustn't do harm to you, and I must help you, in fact, whatever. And then you find a similar principle in Buddhism, and principles about right words and that, and you say, well, there's similarities here. We can get some basic heuristics, a rule of conduct. We shouldn't be saying bad things about people. We shouldn't be hurting humans or animals or whatever, and we can take them. So that's the difficult bit if one is just Gnostic, or if one takes a particular path. And in relation to magic, there is a distinction between magic and mysticism, which is difficult to make at times. But if we go back to the Renaissance, there was distinctions, and scholars have talked about the difference between the natural magic and divine light magic, for example. Now, I think divine light magic is the core bit. It's about a higher order thing. It's not about your will in this thing. It's not about getting things. It's not about achieving things. It's about finding mechanisms to maintain contact with a higher dimension that people believe they're interacting with and going to. And into that come a load of issues. For example, a lot of what people seem to be talking about, for me, when they're talking about some practices or spiritual practices, they seem to be in the lower astral dimensions. Seeing all these strange creatures, they seem to be in that. Now, the mystics don't want to be in there. They're not interested. That's not where they want to be. And they certainly don't want to go there when they're dead, insofar as they can understand what's there. But a lot of the sensational aspects, the sentimental aspects, the easily gained aspects, especially in the drug context, I'm not saying they don't get higher order things, but they're going into zones that other mystics don't really want to spend time in. Or if they have spent time, and I think Charles Upton talked about that, they don't believe that it's meaningful in the long term, because there's deeper principles, and deeper principles which comes back to what you think the ultimate thing is. I sometimes refer to the divine as the unbeknownst, because there's a lot of complications about particular words we use, but something which is the great mystery, if you like, which is beyond comprehension, beyond articulation, but that exists and that I believe exists, and is what you are seeking to connect with. I don't know if that addressed your or some of the questions that you raised. I'll stop there to give you a chance.
Well, I mean, it's. I'm guessing it's kind of a great survey of what perennialism is and might be, and especially for you. And it's interesting because I often say it. I'm going to repeat it. I'm not formally educated, and I have. I've noticed that I might be a mystic myself. Okay, but the way that I live my mysticism is mainly through, and maybe it's a bad path. I don't know. Future will tell, but it's through just personal experience, and as a result, I think maybe what I lack in some ways is how to connect all of these things. So it's something that you're so good at, like how do we, as a species, connect through with all these concepts, and because for me, like sometimes I say as a half joke that I'm a recovering non-dualist, and because you talked about the influence of Eastern religions and on the West, basically, and I was. I guess, like the 14-year-old kid stumbling upon a book about Zen and starting to, do Zazen, and eventually becoming a non-dualist, and subsequently a nihilist who was suffering very much from the experience of the unnameable, like how is it that one can make decisions, life decisions. And it's interesting because to bring it back to magic, I've often been feeling a certain call towards magical practice, but I've never been really able to commit to it because it feels to me like the essence of action is not does not really come from the egoic vehicle and the intellect, and so over time I've kind of cured my my non-dualism, if you want to call it like that, because of and it's a story I've told before also. I'm not going to recount the whole thing, but because of a Rumi poem, actually just a line about the listening to the voice that tells the rose to bloom, and to me that kind of became my center point of focus. Like, this is just what I want to live as the tree and the plants do, as in I don't want necessarily to decide things as much as I well, there is a decision involved, but it stems from a deep feeling of what nature is manifesting through me, and I guess in a way it keeps me a bit isolated, and for me it's a big problem. Like, how can all the people act like that? What would the world look like?
So just last, isolated in what sense?
As in, not necessarily in the literal sense, but yeah, it's hard for me to relate to any concept of what people should do or people shouldn't do, and like, if you have time, we can maybe go towards.
You're stealing in that warehouse.
I'm sorry.
Were you stealing stuff in that warehouse? Are you against people stealing? Oh, I'm joking. A reference back to
I love it.
yeah.
No, I wasn't.
I'm joking for anyone from the warehouse. What you understand the point I'm making?
I'm not there anymore, so even if I did steal, it's too late now.
As a lawyer, don't make any confessions on the. But the well, let me make a few points. The say it could have been that my family going back were Catholics for 1,500 years or Christians. It's possible because if you look at the early things and one of the early saints, there was some relation. So it could have been. So this is a long tradition, that people are willing to throw apart from what the church was. If you look at the early Irish church, it was decentralized, very attached to nature. We have reports, which I think are accurate, from about Columba, for example, his life. He was interacting with angelic beings, with spirits, with lights. They could interpret the weather. They produced the great, the lovely books, the Book of Kells, Celtic Crosses. Navigated Iceland, the Faroes, probably America in little boats. And John Dee probably got most of his secrets from the libraries they robbed from the monks. His big library was obtained from the monks. So the reason he probably knew about where the British Empire was going, because they probably found good maps there. I believe that. It's not mentioned. Of course, during the Reformation, it devastated all the monasteries and took all their learning and then claimed it for themselves. So it was us scientists that brought in all the hospital, all the kind of stuff. They had to replace them because the monks had been doing that, but they had a lot of esoteric knowledge. And of course, people say, "Oh well, there was a Roman Empire that changed." A bit like my argument is different, worked differently. The Roman Empire, spread Catholicism, but Rome had collapsed. Volcanoes go off 536, 540s. We had the Dark Ages as a result of that. It changed Irish society. The pagan society, I believe, linked in. That's why we have the cross with the circle around it. The sun representing the pre-pagan, pre-Christian pagan idea and the Christian thing. So they knew magic, and therefore they were better than some of the traditional magicians. That's why they succeeded. And a lot of the traditional magicians couldn't do their magic anymore. They couldn't bring the sun back because it was full of the clouds of fumes, and their power was gone. So that's, I believe, the source of that Christianity that came into Europe and spread in the monastic tradition before the Normans, and that changed it, because when the Normans invade in 1169, it's a Catholic structure coming into a Catholic country. It was obviously a different type of Catholicism. It was Norman, militaristic, based on the Vikings that had settled in Normandy. And this is the source. These are the same people that are running the world today. I believe that is a consistent tradition with some Roman families from the empire after it collapsed, with imperial ambitions, that worked in conjunction with the city of London. When William the Conqueror came to London, he didn't disestablish the city, the financial or trading area as it was, and that's still an independent. It's one of the longest continuous independent states, if you like, or corporations in the world. And once you mention the city of London, your views will go down, I guarantee you. But so that's not London City. The whole lot of City Westminster is that financial area. So if we look at Steiner said that the most important event in human history was Golgotha. And not only that, but he said that in spiritual terms, that in Ireland, they could perceive what was happening in Golgotha. Not only that, they knew it was going to happen beforehand. Now, this is difficult for people to understand, but this is the different type of esoteric perception that existed in certain contexts. People might find that strange, but there was connections between Britain and Ireland in tin trade and things like that well before the birth of Christ, and it's been proven by archaeological finds. And it was even, of course, that's why William Blake wondered whether Christ had come to Britain, did these feet in ancient times walk upon England, green and pleasant lands. Had Jesus come over to, it's not beyond the bounds of possibility. I'm not saying it's true, but it's established that there was a lot more connections. So what Steiner says is, what he distinguishes is between the Ahrimanic force, the materialist force, the Christ force, and the Luciferic force. What's the Luciferic force? The Luciferic force is this, is the dangerous aspect of mysticism, the idea that you kind of float away from reality into what William Butler Yeats talked about, sipping from the honey pot of the mind and disappearing into some place that's disembodied from reality. And I think that the Christ thing that he emphasizes as well is this incarnational aspect. Whatever way it is, we're in this body, and it's critical in the whole story of that. And even that there's deeper elements to that, because if you look at critiques, The Atlas of AI by Kate Crawford, she talks about, well, when we're analyzing AI, you have to look at its incarnation. How was it formed? And then, of course, you see it's military-industrial complex. But it's a good way of thinking about things, is what Alul was talking about. So this Luciferic thing is a danger, the danger that one is drifting off into, which is a similar thing in the magical thing. And the problem, of course, in the magical thing is if it becomes about controlling things, well, this is the problem. The desire to controlling certain things is different than natural magic or communication, or as you're saying, practices. But if you're trying to control spirits, for example, that's not what the mystical person does. That control thing, and it's also a dangerous thing. I personally warn people about that. It's not my cup of tea. The mystical person is about, which is reflected in the idea, not in a weak way of submission, it's of openness. That's what Kabbalah means in one sense. It's reception. You're being receptive to what's there. That's why you can, when your reception opens up, you can begin to know what's happening on the other side of the world sometimes. That's what some of these gifts will come as spiritual gifts, not as controlled things where in magical tradition they use spirits, they control them. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. And some of the magical traditions are drawing on Christian things to protect them against these evil spirits, although they supposedly don't believe in them. So what we have to distinguish as well is a very important distinction between the psyche and the spirit. What they sought to do in this empire of scientism from 1864 was to distinguish, to cut this transcendent spiritual out of it and to replace something which was about psychic forces, about that. And that's where Jung fits in. So whether Jung and those or people actually believe in the spiritual thing is another question. This is the problem when you read some of the post-humanist things. They say, oh yeah, they get this spiritual thing. It may not be. They may be describing psychic constructs. And there's many of those people. I'm not saying, again not about Debashish, although I would have a different reading of Aurobindo, I think, than he does, because Aurobindo criticizes Nietzsche and the Superman in an essay in, I think it was 1914. So the psyche, and a lot of people can believe in things like egregores and all that because they're more materialist. The Promethean thing as well, it's a material thing, the fire thing. But they don't really believe in spiritual things. They don't believe that there's things there and there's possibilities there. The question that you will have to work out is, what's the relationship between the unbeknownst and what you do in the world? That's the thing. But you're doing something now by addressing and exploring these topics. You're actually doing something in that context. The difficult one is translating this into meaningful terms. But if we can make one or two people understand what post-humanism is and begin to consider it and recognize it, we're doing something useful. So there's power in our discourse, our communication, our exploration, our words, our efforts to analyze, and we can create that dialogue as well, which is magic. Magic is based based
Yeah.
on words. It's about the underlying spirit. Now, the underlying spirit might go on a long journey and find its home. It's easier for me when I'm a bit older to see what I don't want, and it doesn't mean you're not as confused about some, or because some of these issues are beyond comprehension. They're incapable of being answered in the light, and they're not meant to be. But it doesn't take away from the experiential sense of spiritual light, which is a real phenomenon. But you still want to be able to distinguish what's a false thing and what's a real thing. And that's where some of the perennialists or more traditional perennialists will say, well, you need some reference points, because actually it was in La Salette, in one of the apparitions, the Marian apparitions in La Salette in 1836, that I think it was there that it was reported from the Virgin Mary that she warned about people becoming wandering stars. I thought it was a very interesting expression. Nobody talks about it, but it was the idea that you are some kind of spiritual being, but just kind of drifts off into space somewhere with no connection. And that's not what the traditions say. They say you have to. There's a different emphasis in Buddhism and Christianity, for example, and Islam. So it depends on what the thing is. I believe engagement is important. I believe face-to-face is important. I've talked about that. I believe the human is important. I'm going to defend the human. I'm going to defend the significance of human interaction. I'm going to defend the human in its state that it is, and reject these oversimplifications of humanism. So some of these principles will answer the bigger questions, because when you come down and say, well, that's what I kind of important for me, the traditions or whatever they are out there will inform reflexively from your own disposition and what begins to, I won't say feel right, but that is right in a deeper sense.
Well, I can already say that because you mentioned something about doing something and being to incarnating the. I can't remember the word, the term you used, but the light, basically.
Yeah.
And for me, I don't want to make this about myself, but
no, I'm very interested. The learn all is about people's experience. So, fire away.
And I think in some ways it's kind of a singular experience, because a lot of my spiritual growth and evolution has been through making music, especially in the context of grunge and metal, which is kind of strange, but to me, like it informed my spirituality a lot, especially the notion of doing things by yourself, the DIY spirit.
Yes.
And also that notion of not having rules other than authenticity. That's the basis of it all, look. So that's why, especially in the grunge movement, you have all these bands that are associated with the term, but if you listen to them, they sound so different from one another, but we can feel the same spirit, and to me it kind of blew up into my own spirituality, basically, just to me that Rumi quote that I was talking about, it's kind of the central point, and I felt in some of the later years of my life that I kind of was becoming more and more able to listen to that voice. And that's why I decided to write a book last year. I published it earlier this year, about what I called the mystic's path of self-knowledge.
Yes. Yeah.
So to me, if I was able to write that book, being a recovering non-dualist who can't decide on anything, if I was able to write that book and publish it and just follow through with it afterwards, it was the proof that I touched on something, because since writing the book, I have never had as much energy as I have right now, and I keep working all the time. And I'll openly say it right now. This brings no money at all. So that's not like
Money, what's
it's
that?
not a. I'm sorry.
Money, what's that?
What's that? Yeah. Well, that's
Yeah.
that's a discussion we
Yeah.
could have. But anyways, so I mean, it's just you're so good at explaining, at finding the right terms. I wish I was. Well, I don't wish I was as good as you. You're there for that. That's what you're here for.
Well, yeah, you express yourself admirably. I'm very impressed. Yeah, it doesn't. There's many paths to the path, as I've said in, and people can find. I mean, I think you see that in Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha, and a ferryman, ferrywoman, whatever you want. You could, it doesn't matter. It would be a great butcher in the Indian traditions. You can come to it, and certainly the voice is critical. The voice is critical to find your voice. Now, I noticed that, especially when you're an academic, you have to write in a particular style and you're in a straitjacket. And the thing for an artist is to find their voice, because when you come to write, there are other voices in your head. I mean, when you're younger, it's more difficult, I think, because you come to it and there's a voice, which is a form that's being intuited from the reading of a particular type in school or whatever like that. The other voice going, and then you begin to get rid of them voices. And the thing that comes out is yourself, authentic in that sense. It's yourself. And this is, so what we have, as I've explained in the mystical accord, is you have a kind of self and a true self. So the true self is the higher self. Going on back to what you're talking about, the holding guardian angel, you could call it the man of light, the person of light, the other element, the higher spiritual element of yourself. And you're trying to accord with your true self, as opposed to a false self, which is a construction. Where we put you in a box and we say you're this, you're that, and you contribute towards it, and you think that this persona, the mask, is you, and it's not. It's a narcissistic kind of reflection of something. So, I mean, I wrote a book about a dominatrix. I don't think more than a handful of people have written it. I mean, it wasn't really about the gory details, but it was a context in order to explore, well, what are people saying about particular things. It actually anticipated lockdowns in London before the thing, so I was right on my instincts on some of the things. I gave a different reason for artistic reasons, but I knew something was going to happen in London. And I mean, the thing is there. I have London being subject to emergency rule, and that was the year before it, so I could feel that coming again. As there's a testability about some of the things. And the other book I had about Australian fruit bat virus before the thing came out, So these things you can sense, So finding your voice is important, and I think people have to be open to different ways they can communicate. For example, when I wrote my book Plantation of the Automatons, about the future prison that we're going to live in before our final destruction, I don't want people to be depressed, but I mean, this is the implication. If we don't engage in so the other point is, it's very, very easy for you to see what the problem is, and to, by contrast, in opposing it in a peaceful way, to find out what the important things are. The monster is so obvious that it's easy to say, well, we need this strategy to deal with that, or these are the things that it is threatening. So it becomes the contrast becomes so clearer. It becomes easier to say, well, I'm against that, or this is what I am for in this context. But different types of art inspire different things. So when I was thinking about this automatic system that we're going to live in, I was very drawn back to electronic music and stuff that I knew. It was in the back of my head, and particular bands. And I realized that these guys, because a lot of the guys in the kind of electro pop kind of world, a lot of them kind of had kind of tragic lives, a bit like some of the grungy thing as well. There's a bit of a nihilistic thing. But I believe that they were canaries in the coal mine. They saw the possibilities as artists of this stuff, the electronic stuff. And then on a deeper sense, they knew where this was going. I really believe that they were speaking to us. And you can see in some of the lyrics, they really got it. Some of the things you would have dismissed as trite, in the 70s, when you go back and look at it, was actually quite profound. Even you can see it in Kate Bush talking about her computer and that. You say, well, it wouldn't have registered in the same way, but she was getting it. So there was a deep, deep intuition. So musical context, exploration. Again, painting was very, very important for me, because once you concentrate on something and explore it, your intuition opens. And when your intuition opens, the other benefit is, and I don't want to call it the cities, but as a reference point, your spiritual gifts begin to blossom. And to finish off on that point, you reminded me when you talked about the power and the rose. You reminded me that, well, Dylan Thomas, the green fuse that drove the flower, I think. But in particular, I was explaining to someone the lyrics of the song Grace. I don't know if you've ever heard that. It's a nice song. It was written about Joseph Mary Plunkett, who was a poet, one of a number of poets who were executed in 1916. He was one of the signatories of the Proclamation of Independence. And he was married just before his execution to Grace Gifford. So they were married for about 15 minutes. And he had written a poem, and then he was shot. So he had written a poem about his blood upon the rose. And I love so much I could see his blood upon the rose. The point being, for him in Christian terms, the rose represented a spiritual thing. Of course, the rose is a classic symbol. The rose has been significant for me. But the point of really, when you look at a lot of these mystical approaches, they see the interconnectedness and the beauty and the aesthetics in all things. So if you follow it particularly, you'll find and uncover the beauty, and that beauty will bring you to a different place on the spiral. And you may find it in strange places. You may find it in places you didn't expect to find. I was when I look back at some of these guys, like Mackenzie and Dundee, who was a big influence on the electro kind of pop kind of era, and he died tragically. He was from Dundee. He was probably there at the same time I was, and there was a great depth in it, that wasn't obvious when it's in its appearance in a pop context. So, and that's what art is. Not all art is like that, and art certainly changes. But you can come to it by any number of routes. It's where you go to it with, where your powers of perception increase, your powers of, and that it does happen once you allow your intuition to work. And this is what the principles of the cities say. You can get better at things. It's an odd thing, not just better through practice, but your abilities increase. This is the strange process.
Yeah. I guess I can see it. Maybe that's what I was calling learning to learn, in a way.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. I guess intuition plays a big thing into that. Yeah, we're at the end for sure now.
Yeah, and don't anyone ever follow that path for money. Anyway, the mystics genuinely are not that concerned about. Everyone has to live, and people do it a different way. People are more successful, but you really have to follow the currency of your soul, the things that are important. And if you're a mystic, and this is in some of the traditions as well, these things are the currency of the next life as well. The things that you cultivate are the means, not of exchange, of communication in the next world, as you build, as C.S. Lewis talked about, building your spiritual face so you can talk to the gods. If you don't have one, they can't see you. So that's what till we have faces was important for her. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
I love this. It's perfect. I mean, I have so many more questions. I had one that
we can go again sometime. I'm glad. I know you. I've read your book and I know about your interests, so I understand your commitment. Okay. So I'm glad to explore. I understand that you're going through the process of exploration, and we're all doing that. So it's a learning experience for everybody when we kind of understand the context and the choices and the things we have to distinguish between.
Yeah, and to come back to this notion of intuition, and I mean, it's a training for me to keep uh, to keep responding to that I want to call it, I don't want to call it a higher voice because it sounds external to me. It sounds like my true voice, and somewhere within me, like there's this confidence that it wants to come out. So whatever has to happen that allows me to have this come out, it will, and
Yeah.
like, I mean, so far I've been, maybe I don't know if I should say that publicly. I'm gonna knock on wood. Maybe that's gonna help. I've been very extremely fortunate with just the people who have been accepting talking with me. Like I've had a great rate of of people accepting my invitation, and it seems in a way almost magical that it happens that way. So
It's very strange but true principle that there are different rules that operate in relation to the path of spiritual consciousness, and the world begins to behave differently when you bring you open your spiritual consciousness. That's another thing that is not logical. It's not predictable in the same way until one
exactly.
experiences it. And this is a strange phenomenon that there is their own rewards to it, its own meaning. And this is the thing that people are lost with, the nihilistic thing, when they lose meaning. And
Yep.
meaning becomes vindicated, if you like, when one commits to it. One has to marry meaning to some extent, not in an intellectual obsessive way, but in relation
No.
to accepting the fundamental principle of the validity of your own existence, or the Rastafari I and I, kind of the deeper voice, the still small voice that people associate with the divine voice as well, that's in us all, that we have to
Mhm.
allow, and we have to be able to hear, give space to ourselves. Space is a critical word as well. A lot of people don't have space, intellectual space, cutting out things, distractions, whatever, to give that thing so they can hear themselves, they can hear their heart, etc. That's critical, it will always have its own rewards, because that's what all the mystical traditions say. So it's not that the people persist because it's painful. If they persist because there's joy in it's a joyous path in its center and in its end, its objective.
Absolutely. Beautiful words to finish on, James. And I mean, I sure hope we can do this again. I mean, there's so many things I wanted to talk with you about.
Yeah, we will certainly, and it's good sometimes when you've some context to refer to or to move on from, so we understand each other a bit better now, and therefore
Yes.
you have a base to build on and to refine the points that we concentrate on. So, again, thanks very much for the opportunity, Dominique. I enjoyed the conversation, and it's interesting for me to look at other people's explorations and how they go and the trajectory, and we all learn. And the last point out of this, if there's one thing that people take, is that it's often the mystical path which leads to the engagement in the real world and the clarification about what's right and what's wrong. And now there is a right and wrong way to do things sometimes. And out of this, if any of the people watching that don't know anything about post-humanism begin to look at it and begin to see what it is, because they will begin to recognize things that are affecting their world. And you have to understand where these things are coming from to understand whether things are authentic in a deep sense or not. So I'd be happy if one or two people deepened their knowledge, because if we don't, we need a disciplined knowledge as well, because the mystics are not people that are escapist. They're not Luciferian in general like that. They don't drift off into the ether. that generally focus on very real world things. And this is what Evelyn Underhill is very, very clear about, that the genuine mystics, they go off and do all those things, certainly, but they come back to the world with the thing. And this is what even Joseph Campbell, you come back to it and say, here is the thing, you can take it or leave it, but this is what we have to give you from that journey. That's the thing. It's relevant, it's practical, it becomes that, and it becomes refined out of that. So, so post-humanism and those intellectual debates are as relevant to understanding the world that we live in as sitting in the wood under a tree, which is very important too.
Yeah,
okay.
For sure.
Thanks again, and good luck to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay. So you've made it to the end of this Hopscotch Chronicles podcast episode, and I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed doing it. And I thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you're benefiting in a way or another from this conversation. So if you'd like to follow my work, whether on this podcast or my personal work, you can go to Twitter or X and follow me at Domi_Valet, DOMI_Valet. Same username for Instagram, if you prefer that platform. You can also go to the official website for the podcast, which is hopscotchchronicles.com. And if you'd like to support the podcast as well as my personal work, you can do so by subscribing to my Patreon. The address is patreon.com/Dominic Valet, DOMINIC Valet, VALLEE. There you'll find video and audio versions of the episodes without any commercials, as well as special episodes on every Sunday where I take my Sunday afternoon tea with you guys. All right, thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep reaching for the light.